some more speakers. We have now with us Dr. Kataryna Wolczuk. She's from University of Birmingham and also Chatham House in London. Dr. Wolczuk?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to participate. And what I'm going to convey is the message that although we talk about the West in very broad terms, actually, even when it comes to the EU, Russia's war in Ukraine has and is perceived in very different terms. Whether we sit in Italy or in Poland, and perception of the West and Russia is very much different, and it's shaped by historical experiences. And the war is perhaps the most open access war in history, and it's very fast moving, and it's a kind of sort of reality show. And because it's so wide ranging, it has very profound implications for understanding Russia, but also its relations with the broadly defined West, including the US and the EU. And there is a tendency in the West to focus on the known, i.e. the West, especially NATO. So the tendency is to focusing rather on the complexities of when it comes to dealing with Russia, on actually what is easier to understand. And Professor Satter's presentation really outlined the complexity. So we need to, understand, not overplay the role of the West, it's to understand what's happening inside Russia, its own developmental trajectory, but also, as my colleague James Sher says, in order to understand Russia, we need to see what it's been doing in the post-Soviet space. So revising what we know is pivotal, and the war has really prompted us to reflect on where we are coming from, what's happening now, but also what does it mean for the future. And one of the perhaps most profound lessons that we've learned is in the West is our misunderstanding both of the Soviet regime, the nature of the Soviet regime, and post-Soviet Russia. And I have to confess, I'm delighted that Professor Satter mentioned, because I was actually an official election observer in March 2000, and I went to the little-known place Volgodonsk. You will probably never know where it is. I was taken there against my will, and it was one of the 5 places when an apartment building was bombed about 5-6 months before I was there. And it was fascinating to be there. Volgodonsk is a city built by Stalin, by the Gulag prisoners, by forced labors. And there was basically their bodies buried under the city. And during the election night, there was a local historian, and I said at the time, I was doing my doctorate, my PhD, on Ukraine. And he just was puzzled and gave me about a 3-hour lecture that Ukraine is not a real state. And then we went to visit the bombing site. And what was interesting at the time, it was the people there, the Russians from the built basic block, they were there, they were camping, they were staging a protest, and they were telling us they don't think it was the Chechens who did it. They thought it was the basically Russian FSB, security services. So that was an interesting experience. And myself, as so many people, I have basically swept this knowledge under the carpet. By the time I looked at the bombings again, people like Litvinenko, who was basically investigating that, he was already poisoned by radioactive material in London in 2007. So I've been learning my own mistakes, my own omissions from the past, and trying to understand. But also, this brings us to the message, what we know and how we use it. One of the things that I have come across was the fact that allegedly, the US and UK intelligence services knew what was happening, but decided to give Putin the benefit of the doubt, and basically did not use that information to affect or to shape, did not allow that information to shape relations with Russia in any way. I'm saying this because the war has really been like, for us working on the region, it's been like watching, a series of different films, 10, 20 films, and now those films are rolled into now. It seemed like a sequel where everything that we know from the past does play a role. And from that point of view, we are also relearning what we know. And going back to the past, as sort of the first speaker said, is the pivotal dimension. Because when we talk about decoupling of Russia from Europe, my argument is actually that what we can see, Russia wanting Europe to be different. And they are not really engaging with this post-geopolitical Europe, that as long as we have a dialogue, as long as we interact, as long as we are interdependent, we are going to have harmonious relations. It's rather weaponizing interdependence and being very, very successful in terms of actually influencing different actors inside the EU and the US with strategic narratives. But rather than going to talk about this, I'll just focus why the past matters. Why do we need to know, and why it tells us what it tells us about Russia. And Russia's policy, basically war in Ukraine, comes, and all the sort of tectonic shifts that we've seen come really from what could be referred to as Russia's failed attempt to impose or to retain hegemony in the post-Soviet space. So having relied on softer forms of hegemony, moved to harder, and finally, where we are now, and that's the most important lesson, we're talking about the Europe of the 19th century, of countries, basically big powers, being able to change borders by force and to deny, and make nations and states. And I would like just to say that I would really like to whitewash the EU, because even when we look at Ukraine, even if we look at Armenia, the EU has not imposed anything, did not force Armenia to choose. Armenia was forced to choose by Russia, and Armenia was very keen to sign the association agreement with the EU, which was perfectly compatible when it comes to its basic commitments vis-a-vis Russia. But Putin went to the capital of Yerevan, of Armenia, Yerevan, and pronounced that Armenia won't be signing and instead will be joining the Russia-led project. So the EU has been fairly benevolent and awakening now, having this geopolitical awakening, but at different speeds. Different countries in Europe perceive what's happening in the region very much through the prism of their own history, and especially prioritization of Russia rather than perhaps principles of international law. And what is so interesting about the war is that it really takes Russia and Europe to the Tsarist period, to the 19th century period of changing borders by force, of conquest and domination. And Putin made it sort of very explicit, but also of denying of the nations the right to exist. And the Tsarist notion of the 19th century view of Ukraine from Russia was that there were just one big sort of Russian nation divided into three subgroups, including white Russians, i.e. Belarusians, and little Russians, Ukrainians. And that was the 19th century notion. Then came the 20th century, and Lenin, whatever we say about communists, actually embraced the concept of self-determination promoted by President Woodrow Wilson and proclaimed the USSR not to be a prison of nations, but like a greenhouse, like an incubator for different ethnic groups which found themselves in the Soviet Union. And he proclaimed that the Soviet Union would respect and recognize that there are different ethnic groups, including Ukrainians. So the Tsarist period denied the existence of Ukraine. The Soviet Union recognized, and for the last 30 years, since the collapse of the USSR, we actually lived with the Soviet successor states and the existence of Ukraine and its right to basically, to conduct foreign policy in terms of actually having a free trade agreement with the EU. That was not really many people questioned. But now, since February, what we've seen, it's actually denying the right of the Ukrainian nation and people to exist. and depicting, decrying basically Ukraine as a Western project, as the Western subversive project. And many cultural figures from Russia, including a splendid director, an Oscar-winning director, Nikita Mikhalkov, who his film Burned by a Sun is basically a film about Stalin. It's very poignant. You're strongly recommended to watch it if you haven't seen it already. And Mikhalkov now basically proclaims the Ukrainian language to be profoundly anti-Russian. The very sound of the Ukrainian language is an act of aggression against Russia. So this is very interesting because in a way the Kremlin narrative about Ukraine goes back to the 19th century. And yet what we also see there, how it is undone, how Ukraine is made, is by using what also many people, especially in the Baltic countries like Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania know, using Soviet methodology when it comes to self-determination, almost weaponizing and instrumentalizing the concept of self-determination. So what we see is the idea that the borders of Ukraine are illegitimate and then can be basically changed on the basis of some kind of PR exercise or sham referenda, and they could be just proclaimed, which means that withdrawing the recognition of borders, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine means that occupation is a way to basically now determine where borders, not only of Ukraine, but of Russia are. And this is staggering actually to watch because this is the borders of Russia as we speak are in flux. They cannot be determined, and they are going for the first time in European history for 70 years, they are determined yet again on the battleground. And this has profound implications. I'm not going to dwell on this, but actually what it means for issues of citizenship, of human rights, and also of basically going back to the past. And from that point of view, what we see happening in terms of Russia's action and narrative about Ukraine have very, very unpleasant historical reawakening, historical trauma in any countries, including Poland and the Baltic republics, in terms of using this coercion, conquest, oppression, torture and everything as a way to determine the borders of Russia. And that déjà vu, that historical déjà vu, means that the approaches to basically the EU and what the EU does, and also to the blaming NATO for anything, are fundamentally different. So rather than having one Europe, we have actually several European zones when it comes to dealing with Russia. But there is no doubt that the key to understanding Russia is studying what has happened in the past and seeing how the same toolbox and the same aims are reused again and again. And I will finish here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wolczuk. I have a little brief question. I mean, you said this is for the first time in 70 years that the borders of European states have been changed. But what about the proclamation of the independence of Kosovo in January of 2008? We changed the border of Serbia.
But that was done by intervention, humanitarian responsibility to protect, and basically NATO nor the EU have actually occupied Kosovo. They have not. It wasn't basically occupation. The invading force was based on. We may question that how it was done, but nevertheless there was no actually the invader, or use the military force was not there to change the borders as such. So from that point of view, it's definitely, Kosovo is a very, very, very complex precedent, and there's a long story to it, but there's a general tendency to basically instrumentalize the case of Kosovo in terms of precedent. And with Ukraine, we had no basically reason, there was no provocation for Russia, no reason for Russia to invade. So whatever was happening in Kosovo, there was an entirely different story. And neither basically any of the Western powers have actually occupied and decided that Kosovo or Serbia, its borders should be, lands should be incorporated in any of the parties resorting to force.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yes, I have one question. At the beginning, you mentioned the idea of hegemony. What kind of hegemony is Russian pursuing right now? Is an hegemony based on control, influence, or also based on annexation of territories? How would you define this kind of hegemony? And the other question is, you underline that member states of the European Union and other states outside the European Union have a different perception of Russia based on history, for instance. And how would you deal with this different perception? I mentioned the case of Italy, where, for instance, we have a lot of government, central right, central left, all having very good relation with Russia. It was not just the prime minister of Berlusconi, but also the central left government led by Romano Prodi that make the best agreement between Italy and Russia. So as a public opinion, we were quite used to consider Russia, despite the fact of no respect of human rights, of not being a democracy, despite the fact of being an aggressive country. We were used to see as an economic partner. And then you have still the presence of former communist party within Italy that still sympathize with Russia, and also this political vicinity is also based on an anti-American sentiment that reinforced, especially after the U.S. intervention in Iraq. So I mean, the situation is very complex. I just mentioned this country, but I guess there are different perception in different countries. How to deal with that?
Thank you. I'm afraid I don't have answers, because every country has its own portfolio, its own basic configuration of different factors. But what I can say that the fundamental difference is an existential threat, because we are talking about 120 million of people. It used to be before the mobilization in Russia, who were watching the war in Ukraine on a daily basis. This is the historical trauma of being occupied and by Russia. And that's only part of Europe, not the whole. And what we see, and I think Professor Staten mentioned that, what we've seen also is Russia being incredibly sophisticated in engaging with different actors, up to the point that people talk about this transnational clientelism, picking up whether it's Gerhard Schroeder in Germany or Berlusconi in Italy, and developing those ties. But because the threat is not existential, so those are perceived as still legitimate actors. I don't have an answer how to clean, but what I know, it's a massive mistrust in terms of how Russia is able to influence and how it is perceived. And my feeling is that because of the fundamental geopolitical threat, the initiative is shifting to Central and Eastern Europe because the biggest threat is coming from Russia, and some countries have a bit more sort of less urgent issue on this. I don't think it's going to go away, and this will also affect, for example, how the EU is able to work. So I'm, So I'm very actually concerned about the cohesion of the EU, including the issue of EU membership, Ukraine's EU membership. From Poland perspective, that the single most important geopolitical urgent basically task for the EU. From the Italian, it's just the solidarity has been shown, we can move on, nobody takes it seriously. So I cannot see this away, but from Central European perspective, they will rely on the US. So this anti-pro-Americanism is going to divide the EU even more than before.
Can I say something to Kataryna? The fact that you were in Volgodonsk after the bombings means that, in fact, you and I have to speak. You have actually very important information. So very glad to hear that and participate in this seminar with you, but also I will have to contact you. And I mean, even what you've said now is you've conveyed some very important information that needs to be developed, because the people who were bombed, they were aware of who carried it out, and you're quite right that the intelligence services are perfectly aware of who carried it out, and a decision was made in the US in particular not to raise the truth, and that's why we have this war. So anyway, this probably goes beyond the framework of what we're discussing now, but I wanted to catch you while I have you, so to speak. Anyway, sorry.
Great, thank you very much. I'll be only too happy to liaise about this, so I'll send you my email address.
Please do. Yeah, okay. Sorry, if this is a slight, but I mean, it's basic, goes back to the basic fact that a lot of what we have now and with this war situation is a result of the failure of Western policy. This was a preventable war. This war was preventable, and there were repeated opportunities to prevent it. Anyway, so I'm sorry, I will go on with the rest of the conference, of course. Don't want to interrupt.
Well, if I may, then